On a quiet morning in a wealthy Texas suburb, Nathan Brooks stepped outside his front door and froze. A bright red notice had been taped across his gate, flapping gently in the dry summer wind, the kind of paper that seemed almost designed to draw the eyes of every passing neighbor. It was a fine from the Homeowners Association, $9,000, issued over 6 plastic rain barrels sitting quietly behind his house. Victoria Langford, the president of the association, stood at the end of his driveway with a folder pressed against her chest, smiling the way people smile when they already believe they have won something. If the barrels were not removed within 48 hours, she announced to the small crowd gathering behind her, the association would move forward with seizing his property to cover the unpaid debt. Nathan did not argue, and he did not raise his voice. He simply walked to the side of his house, knelt beside the drainage line running quietly beneath his land, and began disconnecting it one joint at a time, as if he already understood something none of them did. 3 days later, the community reservoir that Victoria Langford managed like a private kingdom had dropped by nearly half. It would take her far longer than 3 days to understand that the very land she had just condemned was the thing that had been feeding that reservoir for more than 20 years. Nathan Brooks was 45 years old, a former irrigation engineer who had spent much of his career designing water systems for towns far larger than the one he now called home. He had inherited 6 acres of land from his father, ground that had belonged to the family long before the gated community of Willow Crest Estates ever poured its first foundation. His wife had passed 3 years earlier, and since then he had kept mostly to himself, tending a modest vegetable garden, repairing an old tractor that no longer strictly needed repairing, and collecting rainwater in 6 plastic barrels tucked neatly behind a wooden privacy fence where almost no one from the street could even see them. He was not trying to make a statement to anyone. He simply believed that in a place suffering through its worst drought in decades, water should never be wasted, and he had quietly lived by that belief for years without a single complaint from anyone around him. Most mornings he was up before sunrise, walking the rows of his garden with a cup of coffee in hand, checking soil moisture with the same careful instinct he had once used to evaluate municipal water systems, serving tens of thousands of people. Neighbors who bothered to know him at all described him as polite but private, a man who waved from a distance and helped without being asked, but who rarely lingered long enough for conversation to turn personal. His late wife had loved that same garden, and in the years since her passing, it had become less a hobby than a quiet form of company, something steady to tend while the rest of his life had gone still. Willow Crest Estates itself had been built to project an image of effortless prosperity, wide streets lined with identical mailboxes, strict rules governing everything from trim color to trash can placement, and an association fee that funded a level of manicured uniformity most residents had come to accept as simply the cost of belonging. Victoria Langford had presided over that uniformity for 9 years, ever since a contested election that longtime residents still occasionally referenced with a knowing look. And in that time, she had come to view any deviation from the community's polished appearance as a personal affront rather than a matter of shared preference. Her enforcement of the bylaws had grown steadily more aggressive over the years, and while most residents simply complied to avoid conflict, a quiet undercurrent of resentment had been building long before anyone taped a red notice to Nathan Brooks's gate. Victoria Langford, on the other hand, believed in rules the way other people believed in scripture, and she had built her identity over nearly a decade around the presidency of the Homeowners Association, a position she treated less like a volunteer role and more like a throne she had personally earned. She arrived at Nathan's property that morning with 2 board members trailing behind her and a camera in her manicured hand, walking through his garden as though she already owned every square foot of it. She photographed the barrels from 3 separate angles, tilting her head with visible distaste, then opened a thick binder of community bylaws and began reading aloud. Page 14, Section 9. The clause governing what she called the uniform aesthetic standard for all visible structures on any property within the development. Her voice carried the flat, rehearsed confidence of someone who had delivered this exact speech to many other frightened homeowners before him. Homeowners who had simply paid whatever amount they were told to pay without ever questioning it. Victoria had come to Willow Crest Estates 15 years earlier from a much larger, far stricter community outside Dallas, and she had brought with her a conviction that property values rose or fell entirely on the discipline of the people who lived among them. To her, a rule unenforced was a value slowly eroding, and she had built her reputation on being the one resident willing to say the uncomfortable thing everyone else was too polite to mention. It rarely occurred to her that the discomfort she caused might not always be justified, or that the very authority she wielded so confidently had never once been tested against someone who actually understood the ground beneath their feet better than she did. A small crowd had gathered by then, drawn out of their houses by the flash of a camera and the sight of two board members marching across a neighbor's lawn like inspectors at a border crossing. Some watched with quiet sympathy, others with the detached curiosity of people who were simply relieved. The association's attention had landed on someone else's yard for once. One elderly woman from 2 doors down whispered to her husband that she had always admired the tidy rows of vegetables behind Nathan's fence, and could not understand what aesthetic offense 6 gray plastic barrels could possibly cause when nobody could even see them from the sidewalk. A teenager on a bicycle slowed to watch, phone forgotten in his pocket, sensing without quite understanding why that something unfair was unfolding on an ordinary Tuesday morning in front of him. Even the 2 board members trailing Victoria seemed faintly uncomfortable, exchanging a brief glance neither of them acknowledged out loud, as though some quiet part of them already suspected this particular fight was not one their side would ultimately win. Victoria heard the whisper and chose to ignore it entirely, turning back to her binder as though the opinion of a bystander carried no more weight than the wind. Nathan tried to explain, calmly and without a hint of defensiveness, that the barrels were part of a legal rainwater harvesting system, fully permitted under Texas state law, designed specifically to reduce runoff and conserve water during exactly the kind of drought the entire region was now suffering through. He pointed out that the barrels sat well behind a privacy fence, invisible from the street entirely, and that not a single neighbor had ever once complained about them in the years since he installed them. He even offered, in a tone far more patient than the moment probably deserved, to repaint them or screen them further if appearance was truly the board's only concern. Victoria barely glanced in his direction. She closed her binder with a soft, decisive snap, and told him flatly that the association's aesthetic standards existed independently of anyone's personal opinion about drought conditions or water conservation. By the end of that same day, an official notice had already been delivered to his mailbox, printed on association letterhead, stamped and signed, a fine of $9,000, a 48-hour deadline for compliance, a quiet, buried threat that failure to remove the barrels could eventually result in a formal lien being placed against his property. That evening, Nathan sat alone at his kitchen table with the notice spread out in front of him, the paper catching the amber light of sunset pouring through the window behind the sink. He did not reach for his phone to call a lawyer, and he did not reach for anger either, not yet. Instead, he walked down into the cellar beneath his house, where his father had carefully kept every document related to the land going back more than 3 decades, boxes labeled in faded ink, folders yellowed with age. He pulled out an old rolled map, its edges soft and brittle, and spread it carefully across the table under the kitchen light. He traced a faded blue line with one finger, following it from the hills behind his property all the way down toward the community reservoir in the distance, remembering the summer his father had first walked him along that very slope as a boy, pointing out where the water gathered after every storm, and explaining, in the unhurried way he explained everything, that land carried responsibilities most people never bothered to notice. He recalled his father's voice more clearly than he had in years, patient and low, telling him that helping a neighbor cost nothing when you had more than enough to spare. He allowed himself, for the first time all day, to smile. If Victoria Langford wanted to play by the rules, he thought quietly to himself, then he would show her exactly whose rules had been keeping her precious reservoir full all along. The map Nathan found that night told a story that almost no one in Willowcrest Estates remembered, or had likely ever known in the first place, since most of the current residents had moved in long after the deal had been struck. Back in 1989, long before a single house had been built on what were now manicured lawns and quiet cul-de-sacs, his father had entered into an informal agreement with the original land developer who had first envisioned the community. The natural slope of the Brooks property funneled rainwater downhill through a shallow forested basin, and the developer wanted that water redirected into a new artificial reservoir that would eventually supply the entire community's landscaping and irrigation needs for decades to come. Nathan's father agreed, not for money, but because it seemed at the time like the neighborly thing to do for people who had not even moved in yet. The arrangement was documented in a handshake and a modest, informal easement, granting free and permanent passage of natural rainwater runoff across the Brooks land and directly into what would eventually become the association's reservoir. There was, however, one critical clause buried deep in the fine print of that decades-old agreement, a clause the original developer had almost certainly never expected anyone to actually invoke. The landowner, and only the landowner, retained the unrestricted right to terminate the water passage at any time, for any reason, entirely without needing the association's permission or approval. For over 20 years, Nathan and his father before him had simply let the water flow freely, asking nothing at all in return, never once threatening to cut it off even during earlier, more reasonable disputes with previous HOA boards long before Victoria's time. When neighbors would sometimes ask Nathan why his family had never charged the association a single cent for something so genuinely valuable, he would only shrug and say that he figured his neighbors needed the water far more than he needed the money. That quiet, unassuming generosity was about to become the very weapon Victoria Langford never once saw coming. Before calling anyone at all, Nathan spent 2 quiet evenings reviewing every page of the 1989 agreement with the same discipline he had once brought to reviewing municipal contracts, cross-checking the termination clause against current state water law to make absolutely certain nothing had changed in the decades since it was signed. He drove to the county courthouse himself and requested certified copies of the recorded easement, just to be sure his father's handshake deal had been properly filed and not merely remembered. Only once he was fully satisfied that every step he intended to take stood on solid legal ground did he allow himself to move forward. Within days, Nathan made a decision that surprised even himself with its calm, methodical precision. He called a small excavation crew, men he had once worked alongside during his years as a practicing engineer, and asked them to dig a narrow trench along the eastern edge of his property line. The work itself was simple, almost unremarkable to look at from the road. New culverts were laid carefully into the earth. A section of old drainage piping was rerouted just slightly, following a gentler slope than before. Every single shovelful of dirt moved that week was entirely within the legal boundaries of his own land, and every permit required for the work was already in his name, from years of quietly maintaining the very system the association had never once bothered to understand or even acknowledge. The change itself was subtle to the eye, but absolute in its effect. Instead of continuing its decades-old path downhill into the community reservoir, the rainwater now curved gently westward instead, spilling into a natural wetland basin that had existed on the property long before any development plans were ever even drawn on paper. Nathan broke no laws in doing this. He violated no ordinance, no covenant, no restriction of any kind. He simply redirected what had always, legally and unambiguously, been his alone to redirect however he saw fit. When Victoria Langford drove past a few days later in her polished white sedan and noticed the fresh trench lines cutting neatly through his yard, she rolled down her window and laughed out loud, calling across the fence that a little ditch was not going to intimidate her or her board of directors. Nathan straightened up slowly, wiped the dirt from his hands onto his jeans, and answered her with a quiet, almost gentle finality, telling her he was simply returning the water to exactly where nature had always intended it to go in the first place. Victoria drove off, shaking her head, already composing in her mind the next steps she assumed would put him firmly back in his place, never once pausing to ask an engineer, a lawyer, or even a curious neighbor what that small trench might actually mean for the reservoir she had spent a decade treating as the community's crown jewel. The crew finished their work by early afternoon, tamping down the last stretch of fresh soil and coiling their hoses without ceremony, unaware that the quiet afternoon's labor had just rewritten the water map of an entire subdivision. A full week passed before anyone at Willow Crest Estates noticed anything unusual happening at all. The drought continued to tighten its grip across the entire region, temperatures climbing well past 100 degrees day after day, lawns browning across every neighborhood for miles in every direction. But it was the community reservoir, the very one Victoria proudly showcased year after year in the association's glossy annual newsletter, that began sinking at a rate absolutely no one could immediately explain. The maintenance crew reported the water level dropping by inches every single day, far faster than simple evaporation alone could ever account for, even under that brutal, relentless heat. Victoria, entirely unwilling to consider that her own recent decisions might somehow be connected to the sudden shortfall, immediately assumed there had to be a leak somewhere deep within the old concrete basin itself. She authorized an expensive engineering inspection almost immediately, bringing in a private firm from the city to examine every single inch of the reservoir's aging structure for cracks or hidden seepage points. The engineers, after 2 full days of careful inspection, found absolutely nothing. No fractures anywhere in the concrete lining. No evidence whatsoever of a burst pipe or a broken valve. No sign of unauthorized water usage anywhere on the property according to their instruments. Security cameras positioned around the perimeter of the reservoir showed nothing out of the ordinary either. No trespassers slipping through the fence line at night, no theft of any kind, nothing at all, but still, undisturbed water slowly and mysteriously disappearing day by day. The lead engineer, a soft-spoken man named Gregory Palmer, told Victoria plainly during their final walkthrough that whatever was happening had nothing to do with the reservoir's structure itself, and that if she truly wanted an answer, she would need to look upstream at whatever was feeding the basin in the first place. Victoria thanked him for his time, paid his invoice without argument, and quietly filed his warning away as an inconvenience rather than a clue worth pursuing any further. Meanwhile, just beyond the tree line at the edge of the development, Nathan continued his quiet daily routine, watering his tomatoes and his peppers from barrels that were, ironically enough, now filling faster than they ever had before. He said nothing to anyone about any of it. He did not need to. The community's true and largest source of water, unknown to almost every single resident who lived there, had always been the acres of forested land quietly funneling rainfall downhill from the Brooks property, and now, for the first time in over 2 decades, that source had simply stopped giving. As the reservoir continued its slow but steady decline, the Homeowners Association scrambled to respond, and the response Victoria ultimately chose only made things considerably worse. She pushed through an emergency measure restricting all residents to watering their lawns only twice per week, and alongside it, a sharp and unpopular increase in the community's monthly water fees to help cover the mounting cost of the ongoing but entirely fruitless engineering investigation. Residents who had spent years quietly tolerating the association's petty rules about mailbox colors and fence heights suddenly found themselves furious over something that actually affected their daily lives in a real and tangible way. Front lawns turned brittle and yellow within days. Flower beds wilted helplessly under the relentless summer sun. And every single week the water bills climbed a little higher, while the official explanations from the board grew a little thinner. Local landscaping crews, usually booked solid through the summer season, began fielding cancellations from homeowners who no longer saw the point in paying for services their restricted watering schedule could not sustain. Children's pools sat empty in more than one backyard, and the community's shared clubhouse fountain, once a small point of pride at the entrance to the development, was drained entirely and covered with a tarp to save what little water remained for the reservoir itself. What had once felt like a minor inconvenience was quickly becoming, for many families, a genuine strain on daily life. It was Mark Jensen, a longtime resident who had originally sided firmly with the association during Nathan's initial fine, who first asked the question that would eventually unravel everything Victoria had built. Standing in the parking lot after a particularly tense community meeting, he turned directly to Victoria and asked, simply and without any hostility in his voice, why the reservoir had never once run short during 20 years of previous droughts, some of them considerably worse than this one. Yet suddenly this year, it could barely stay half full, no matter what they tried. Victoria offered only vague talk of aging infrastructure and unpredictable weather patterns, deflecting the pointed question with the same practiced ease she used on almost everything. She reminded the crowd, as she often did when cornered, that the board worked tirelessly on behalf of every homeowner, and that patience, not panic, was what the situation called for. A few residents nodded along out of habit, the way people often do when a familiar voice speaks with enough confidence, but the nodding was noticeably thinner than it had been in years past. Someone near the back muttered that patience did not explain a reservoir vanishing in broad daylight, and though Victoria pretended not to hear it, the comment lingered in the humid evening air long after the meeting adjourned. Nathan, standing quietly near the back of the small crowd that evening, said absolutely nothing at all. Mark Jensen had spent years serving as one of Victoria's most reliable allies on minor disputes, voting alongside her on fence heights and holiday decoration limits without a second thought, and it unsettled him more than he wanted to admit that she could not offer him a single straight answer about something as basic as where their water actually came from. He found himself thinking back to the morning of Nathan's fine, remembering how uneasy he had felt watching Victoria parade her binder across a quiet man's lawn, a feeling he had swallowed at the time out of loyalty to the board. That unease was returning now, sharper and harder to ignore. But someone else at that meeting had been listening very closely, taking careful notes on a small pad, and asking herself the very same question Mark had just voiced out loud for everyone to hear. Sarah Miller, a local reporter for the regional paper, had spent nearly a decade covering small-town disputes of every conceivable kind, and something about this sudden and unexplained water crisis at Willow Crest Estates struck her as far more interesting than the average homeowners association's squabble over paint colors or lawn ornaments. She began digging methodically through public records at the county office the very next morning, pulling old drainage maps, original construction permits, and decades-old easement filings that most people in the community had long since forgotten even existed. She spent 2 full afternoons in a windowless records room, sifting through cardboard boxes of surveyor notes and permit applications that had not been touched in years, cross-referencing parcel numbers against a hand-drawn subdivision plan that predated the community's official incorporation by nearly a decade. A clerk who had worked at the county office since before the development existed remembered, when Sarah asked, that there had been talk decades earlier of a water-sharing arrangement tied to the Brooks land. though she could not recall the specifics, and had assumed it had long since been formalized or forgotten entirely. That single offhand comment sent Sarah back into the archives with renewed determination, and it was there, near the bottom of a box labeled simply with a year and nothing else, that she finally found what she had been searching for. What she uncovered over the following days genuinely astonished her. The community reservoir, despite being marketed for years in glossy brochures as a natural water feature fed by underground springs, had no spring feeding it at all. It had no well of its own. It had no natural aquifer connection whatsoever listed anywhere in the county's official geological surveys. Instead, buried deep inside a dusty folder of 1989 development paperwork, Sarah found the original easement agreement, the exact same document Nathan had pulled from his own cellar weeks earlier, granting rainwater passage from the Brooks property into what would eventually become the association's reservoir. The entire artificial lake that Victoria Langford had spent years proudly boasting about at community galas and holiday gatherings had, in reality, been quietly sustained for more than 2 decades by 6 acres of privately owned land that the association itself had just fined its owner $9,000 for daring to conserve water on. When Sarah's story finally broke online and in print 2 days later, the headline alone was enough to send Victoria Langford's phone ringing off the hook from early morning until well past midnight. Copies of the article circulated through mailboxes and doorsteps across the neighborhood by that same afternoon, passed hand to hand between residents who could hardly believe what they were reading about a man most of them had barely noticed before that summer. Sarah's reporting was careful and precise, laying out the easement, the missing spring, and the timeline of Nathan's find in plain, unembellished language that let the facts speak for themselves without needing to editorialize. Within the association's private message boards, the tone shifted almost overnight from irritation over watering restrictions to open outrage at the board's leadership, with dozens of comments demanding an emergency meeting before the week was even out. She was, for perhaps the first time in a very long time, completely and utterly speechless in front of her own board. Rather than apologize or attempt to quietly resolve the matter, Victoria doubled down instead, deciding that the best defense was an aggressive offense, and she directed the association's longtime attorney, David Owens, to file a formal lawsuit against Nathan Brooks demanding immediate restoration of the water flow, along with substantial financial compensation for what she described in the filing as reckless and malicious damage to community property. David Owens, a cautious and experienced man who had quietly warned Victoria against this exact move behind closed doors more than once, sat with the draft complaint open on his desk for nearly an hour before signing it, turning over in his mind the same uncomfortable question the judge would later ask out loud in open court. He had reviewed the original 1989 paperwork himself years earlier during a routine title search, and had never once flagged the termination clause as a risk, assuming, as everyone else had, that a family who had never enforced its rights in 20 years never intended to. He filed the paperwork anyway, bound by his professional obligation to represent the board's official decision even when he privately doubted its wisdom and its chances in court. Nathan, calm as ever throughout the entire ordeal, hired a young but remarkably sharp property attorney recommended to him by an old engineering colleague, and began preparing for the hearing without a single trace of panic in his voice or his manner. The courtroom on the day of the hearing was fuller than almost anyone had expected, packed wall to wall with curious residents eager to finally see how this strange and increasingly public dispute would resolve itself once and for all. Nathan's attorney laid the original 1989 agreement directly on the evidence table for the judge to examine, along with certified county records proving unbroken, uninterrupted ownership of the land by the Brooks family for well over 3 decades running. She walked the judge patiently through the termination clause line by line, emphasizing the same clause granting the landowner unconditional authority to end the water passage at absolutely any time he chose. David Owens rose briefly to argue that decades of unspoken tolerance amounted to an implied ongoing right of access regardless of the written termination clause, but the judge cut him off gently, reminding the courtroom that implied rights could not simply override the plain, unambiguous language of a signed agreement, however long that agreement had gone quietly unenforced. Nathan's attorney followed with a single pointed question of her own, asking David directly whether the association had ever, at any point in 20 years, sent so much as a letter of thanks for water it had never paid for. He had no answer to offer. When the judge finally turned toward the association's table and asked, in a tone that seemed to carry more genuine curiosity than sympathy, whether the association had ever once compensated the Brooks family for 2 decades of continuous water rights, the silence that followed stretched on long enough to become its own kind of damning answer. Sensing the momentum shifting entirely and unmistakably in his favor, Nathan chose that exact moment to reveal something even more damaging than the water rights dispute itself, something that had nothing to do with legal technicalities and everything to do with simple, basic decency. For 20 years, he told the courtroom in a steady, unwavering voice. His family had personally maintained every culvert, every drainage pipe, and every single inch of infrastructure carrying water toward the reservoir, clearing debris after every major storm, repairing erosion damage entirely out of his own pocket, all without a single cent of compensation or even a word of acknowledgement from the association in return. The Homeowners Association, he pointed out plainly, had never spent one single dollar maintaining the very system that had kept their prized reservoir full through 2 full decades of droughts and dry summers alike. The reaction rippling through the gallery was immediate and entirely unmistakable, a wave of murmurs spreading through rows of residents who suddenly understood the true scale of what their own association president had done to one of their neighbors. These were people who had personally paid Nathan's $9,000 fine countless times over in their own inflated water bills and strict lawn restrictions, all while the very man responsible for keeping their homes green had been quietly punished for simply trying to conserve water. When the community meeting following the hearing convened at the clubhouse just days later, residents did not wait politely for a formal agenda item to demand answers, standing and shouting over one another, asking Victoria directly and repeatedly why she had chosen to fine and threaten the exact person who had been keeping their entire neighborhood alive through the worst drought anyone could remember. One young father near the front held up a printed copy of Sarah's article and read the headline aloud for the entire room to hear, his voice cracking with an anger he had clearly been holding back for days. An older resident who had lived in the community since it was first built stood and reminded everyone that she had personally met Nathan's father decades earlier, and that the family had never once asked for anything beyond basic courtesy in all that time. Victoria sat through nearly 40 minutes of it without managing a single coherent response, her binder, for once, closed and untouched on the table in front of her. The backlash against Victoria Langford spread through the community faster than the drought itself ever had. A petition began circulating almost immediately among residents, demanding her removal from the board altogether, gathering more than 200 signatures within a single week, an overwhelming majority of every household in the development. An emergency vote was called soon after, and when the final ballots were counted late one evening, Victoria was formally and decisively removed from her position as president, stripped of the authority she had held for nearly a decade with an iron and unyielding grip. Alongside her removal, an independent financial audit was launched into years of association spending, an audit that would later reveal a troubling pattern of questionable expenses and selectively enforced fines that had disproportionately targeted residents who dared to challenge her decisions or question her authority in any meaningful way. The auditors found that fines issued during Victoria's tenure had fallen almost exclusively on residents who had publicly disagreed with her at open meetings, while friends and allies on her side of the neighborhood had quietly avoided even minor citations for violations far more visible than 6 barrels behind a fence. The findings were presented at a follow-up meeting attended by nearly every household in the development, and by the time the numbers were read aloud, there was little sympathy left in the room for the woman who had once controlled it so completely. The $9,000 fine against Nathan was unanimously overturned by the newly reformed board within days of the vote, quietly erased from the association's official records as though it had never once existed at all. More than that, the board issued a formal and very public apology, printed prominently on the front page of the same community newsletter that had once celebrated Victoria's leadership year after year, acknowledging openly the harm that had been done, and pledging fair compensation for the legal costs Nathan had personally incurred defending himself against a lawsuit he never wanted in the first place. It was Victoria herself, humbled in a way very few people in the neighborhood had ever witnessed before, who eventually walked alone up Nathan's driveway one quiet evening, without her usual entourage of board members or her familiar binder of bylaws in hand. She stood on the porch for a long moment before speaking, glancing once at the 6 barrels still visible faintly through a gap in the fence, the very objects that had started everything. She told him quietly, almost in a whisper, that she had been wrong about him from the very beginning, and that she had spent so many years enforcing rules that she had forgotten to ask whether the rules themselves were ever actually fair. Nathan, standing calmly at his front door with no trace of triumph anywhere in his expression, simply told her that all he had ever truly wanted was to be treated like an ordinary neighbor, nothing more and nothing less. In the weeks that followed her removal, Nathan proposed something that genuinely surprised the entire community, an offer rooted not in quiet revenge, but in the same generosity his family had shown for well over 3 decades, without ever asking for anything in return. He agreed to fully restore the natural water flow back toward the community reservoir, but only under new terms negotiated fairly and transparently with the newly reformed board of directors. The updated board would sign a legitimate, binding contract formally recognizing his property rights, paying a modest and entirely reasonable fee for the continued water passage going forward. Rainwater harvesting systems, far from being banned or fined ever again, would now be explicitly protected under the community bylaws and even actively encouraged, with the association promoting conservation efforts rather than punishing residents for practicing them. The new agreement was drafted jointly by Nathan's attorney and the association's revised legal counsel, reviewed line by line at an open meeting where every resident was invited to ask questions before the final vote was taken. It passed almost unanimously, with only a handful of abstentions from board members who had once served closely under Victoria and still seemed uneasy about how thoroughly the community's trust in leadership had been shaken. Mark Jensen, in a small but meaningful gesture, volunteered to chair the new Water Conservation Committee himself, telling the room that he intended to make sure no resident was ever again treated the way Nathan had been treated over something as simple as trying to save water. Within a single month, something genuinely remarkable began happening across Willow Crest Estates, as dozens of residents, inspired quietly by what Nathan had been doing for years without any recognition at all, began installing their own rain barrels and water conservation systems behind their homes. What had once been dismissed as an eyesore worth a $9,000 fine slowly became a point of real pride throughout the neighborhood, discussed openly and warmly at community gatherings that no longer felt tense or hostile the way they once had. The reservoir itself, replenished steadily by the restored natural flow, and now supplemented further by dozens of new household systems working quietly in harmony together, slowly climbed back toward its original depth, just as the drought finally began to break across the region in the months that followed. The story of Willow Crest Estates traveled well beyond the boundaries of its own quiet streets in the weeks that followed, picked up by other regional outlets curious about a dispute that seemed to capture something larger than one neighborhood's water troubles. Other homeowners associations in nearby communities quietly revisited their own bylaws that summer, some proactively updating language around rainwater collection before anyone had the chance to file a complaint at all. Nathan never sought any of that attention for himself, declining most interview requests that came his way, and asking Sarah, the one reporter he did trust, to keep the focus on the lesson rather than on him personally. He returned as much as he could to the same quiet rhythm he had always kept: his garden, his coffee at sunrise, the low hum of water moving steadily through channels his family had tended for 3 generations. Sarah Miller closed out her long-running coverage of the entire saga with a final piece that captured, far more effectively than any courtroom ruling ever could, exactly what had truly happened in that quiet Texas suburb. She wrote that no single man had ever drained a community reservoir on his own, and that the only thing genuinely capable of causing that kind of lasting damage had been the arrogance of an institution that mistook its own rules for something more powerful than fairness, more powerful than basic gratitude, and more powerful, in the end, than the very people it had always claimed to serve. On a warm, quiet evening not long after the story finally settled, Nathan stood alone at the edge of his garden, watching fresh rainwater funnel gently through the newly restored channels toward the reservoir shimmering in the distance, its surface catching the last soft orange light of the setting sun. The 6 barrels behind his fence, the very same ones that had started this entire chain of events months earlier, sat full and completely undisturbed now, no longer hidden from anyone passing by, no longer any source of shame or quiet conflict between neighbors. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the reservoir shimmered again, whole and full at last, sustained not by force or fines or empty threats, but by the same quiet decency that had carried that water faithfully for over 30 years. When power forgets the very people it was meant to serve and bends its own rules to bully the honest and the patient, the truth has a way of finding its own path forward, steady and unstoppable, flowing onward the same way water always finds a way to flow. Nathan lingered there a while longer as the light faded, listening to the faint sound of water moving through the channels his father had first opened decades before, a sound that had once meant nothing to anyone in Willow Crest Estates, and now meant almost everything. He thought of his father's voice again, patient and unhurried, telling him that land carried responsibilities most people never noticed until it was too late to ignore them. Somewhere down the slope, the reservoir kept filling, quietly, faithfully, the way it always had before anyone ever tried to claim it belonged to them alone. And in the stillness of that ordinary evening, nothing about the moment felt like victory, only balance finally restored, the water flowing again exactly where it had always been meant to go.